Hey, what's up, everyone? Gaming Hearts 1 here, and today I'm going to talk about Final Fantasy and what could possibly be the best Final Fantasy game, I guess, ever made. There's a lot of people who have various opinions about which Final Fantasy game is the best, but there's a lot of people who go on record and say that 7 is probably the best of all time, mainly due to how popular it has been since its release in 1997, which is like 25 years ago, and it was very popular on the PS1. I believe it managed to reach over 10 million in terms of sales. And on top of that, the Final Fantasy VII storyline was one that a lot of people can get into. Had memorable, larger than life characters. You had Cloud Strife, you had Tifa Lockhart, you had Sephiroth, and pretty much there was an interesting story to be told. And then you had the prequel that came before that, which was Crisis Core, which came out about 10 years later in 2007 for the PSP, which many people loved as well. And I do feel like if that game was initially released for the PlayStation 3, it could have been more popular during the 2000s, but whatever. A lot of people would go on record and say that Final Fantasy VII is probably one of the greatest JRPGs of all time, especially considering the fact that it recently got a remake about 2 years ago, almost 3 years ago, on the PlayStation 5, PS4, and PC. And I believe the Final Fantasy VII remake managed to reach at least 5 million in terms of sales. And everything about that game looked amazing. It was well polished. The voice acting was great. And it was a remake that exceeded many people's expectations. It was definitely one of those titles that was basically Game of the Year candidate from all I'm concerned. And a lot of people would say that that game was almost as popular, if not more popular, than Cyberpunk 2077, but it really depends on who you ask. And 2020 was a very chaotic year in general, and video games was something that I don't think too many people were thinking about, although everybody was waiting for the release of the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series X that year. And in terms of awesome Final Fantasy games that's come out since 1987. There's been a handful. You have Final Fantasy 4, 5, 6. You have 8. You have 9. You have 10. You have 12. And you had 15, which came out back in 2016. And right now, we're all anticipating the release of Final Fantasy 16, which is supposed to be coming out next year in 2023. Now, Final Fantasy 11 and 13 are largely forgotten because I believe Final Fantasy 11 was supposed to be like an MMORPG or something like that. And even though Final Fantasy 11 was like ahead of its time, it was one that really didn't catch on because by the time that game was released, we were still in like the PS2 era of gaming. And, for the most part, people cared more about, I guess, local gameplay and replay value and stuff like that. And Final Fantasy XI, for the most part, is largely forgettable. If you ask the average person if they can name one person from Final Fantasy XI, they'll be like, or one major character, they probably wouldn't be able to tell you anything. And Final Fantasy XIII, which came out back in, I believe, in the late 2000s, it was 2009 if I'm not mistaken, that was the one that had Lightning as the main character. And the thing about her is that a lot of people consider her to be a forgettable character as well, mainly because she came off as very bland, didn't have any personality, didn't have nearly as much charisma as I guess Yuna from the Gullwings from Final Fantasy X or Tifa Lockhart from Final Fantasy 7. Around the late 2000s, it seemed like the Final Fantasy series started to take a nosedive in terms of popularity. And that was especially true like going into 2010 because that's when the original Final Fantasy 14 game came out. And I believe that game was one that was initially panned by critics during its launch because it fell below people's expectations. And then I think A Realm Reborn came out back in 2013, and I guess that was like the remake of Final Fantasy 14 because they wanted to I guess, redo the botched launch of Final Fantasy 14, and they did it in 2013. And that particular game was well received, but it seemed like in 2016, that's when the main series really started to pick up in terms of popularity, because Final Fantasy 15 was a massive success, and it was probably one of the best RPGs, if not one of the best video games of 2016. And honestly, I do feel that out of all the Final Fantasy games that has been released, within the past 30 years or so, I think Final Fantasy VII is the one that stands the test of time to this day. And I believe we're supposed to be getting a part 2 to the Final Fantasy VII remake. So basically, you can see that Square Enix is still milking, Final Fantasy VII out for as much as they can, and it still goes to show you that the Final Fantasy series is still a huge attraction. And I do feel that a decade from now, like, the Final Fantasy VII remake is going to be looked back fondly upon by hardcore fans of the series and critics as well.